August 1940. Dawn creeps slowly across the southern coast of England. The sea lies still, a sheet of dull pewter beneath a low, sullen sky. Along the cliffs near Ventnor, tall lattice towers stand like sentinels, silent, unmoving, yet alive with invisible energy. Inside a small operations hut, the air smells faintly of ozone and tea gone cold. A young WAAF operator, headphones pressed tight against her ears, studies the thin green trace sweeping across the cathode ray tube. Static hums punctuated by the steady pulse of a transmitter 40 miles away. Then something unusual. A faint echo, barely a whisper, flickers at extreme range. She marks it calmly, slides a counter across the plotting table, and calls her section chief. At Bentley Priory, north of London, the plot takes shape amid a dozen others. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding leans closer, his expression unreadable. Telephones chatter, markers move, squadrons scramble. In the chill morning air of a dispersal field, engines turn over, props bite the mist, and the sound of Merlins rises like an overture. Yet none of this, the vigilance, the calm precision, the early warning, would have existed without one man who, 5 years earlier, was asked to build a death ray. He offered radar instead. Britain, 1933. Europe trembled under the rise of new powers. Adolf Hitler had come to the Chancellorship of Germany in January, promising renewal and revenge. Within months, German aircraft factories, long dormant under the Versailles restrictions, began to hum again. The Luftwaffe was being born. Across the Channel, Britain watched uneasily. The scars of the Great War were still fresh. A generation lost in Flanders left the nation weary of conflict and reluctant to spend on armaments. But a quiet realization began to settle within the Air Ministry. The next war, if it came, would begin in the skies. The public remembered the terror of the First World War's Gotha and Zeppelin raids, London aflame, civilians dead in their homes. In the 1930s, as newspapers filled with photographs of new German bombers, a new fear took hold. Journalists called it the knockout blow. They imagined cities erased in hours by fleets of bombers no fighter could stop. Britain's defensive problem was stark. How to intercept a bomber that could cross the Channel in 20 minutes. Fighter aircraft were few, fuel limited, and pilots precious. Without warning, even the most agile interceptor was useless. The air defense of Great Britain, still a loose structure, had no eyes beyond the horizon. In 1934, the Air Ministry formed the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense. Chaired by the distinguished physicist Sir Henry Tizard, its task, to examine every conceivable scientific means to defend the country from air attack. Among its more eccentric proposals came one from within the Air Ministry itself, a speculative question sent to the Radio Research Station at Slough. Could a powerful radio beam destroy an aircraft at a distance? Could science deliver a death ray? The memorandum arrived on the desk of Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist known for his work on radio direction finding. He was no dreamer. His mind was disciplined, his humor dry. A death ray? He remarked. Better to detect the enemy than to toast him. That subtle shift in thinking from destruction to detection would alter the course of modern warfare. Watson Watt's assistant, Arnold Skip Wilkins, began calculations. He realized that the reflected radio waves from an aircraft, illuminated by existing transmitters, could in theory be measured. It was an idea at once simple and profound. The air itself could be made to speak of an approaching enemy. To prove it, Watson Watt proposed a test, the Daventry experiment. On 26 February 1935, using the BBC's shortwave transmitter at Daventry and a Handley Page Hayford bomber as the target, the team drove a van laden with receivers to a field near Weedon. The weather was cold, the ground wet underfoot. As the aircraft flew overhead, the oscilloscope trace danced. The signal fluctuated, proof that radio waves had been disturbed by the passing aircraft. It was the first detection of an aeroplane by radio. Within days, the Air Ministry understood its implications. Britain had found a way, not to destroy bombers, but to see them coming. By summer 1935, Watson Watt's team relocated to Bawdsey Manor, a windswept estate on the Suffolk coast. There, in converted stables and drafty rooms, they developed the technology that would soon be known as RDF, radio direction finding, the cover term for what would later be called radar. They built transmitters of formidable power, receivers of unexpected delicacy, and devised a network of stations to blanket the coast. Each test brought improvements. Towers grew taller, oscillators more stable, echoes clearer. By 1936, aircraft could be detected at over 80 miles. Britain's coastline, once blind, was beginning to open its eyes. In committee rooms and laboratories, a new phrase took hold: the chain-home system. These radar stations, linked together, would form an unbroken watch along the eastern and southern shores. The idea was ambitious, perhaps impossible, but so was the alternative. By 1938, against the backdrop of Munich and appeasement, steel lattice masts began to rise above Suffolk and Kent. To villagers, they looked ungainly, giant scaffolds standing idle among sheep fields. Few guessed they were the first line of defense against invasion. Each tower pulsed with invisible power. Each echo that returned carried a warning from the sky. Britain, still at peace, was quietly building the nervous system that would one day save her. By the summer of 1938, the impossible experiment had matured into a functioning weapon of awareness. Along the eastern coast of Britain, from the Firth of Forth to the Isle of Wight, the chain-home stations stood watch. Each site bore the same hallmarks: 4 towering steel masts for transmission, 4 smaller wooden towers for reception, and a low hut filled with humming valves, dials, and cathode ray displays. The men and women who operated them were engineers, technicians, and wireless experts, many drawn from the post office engineering department, universities, and private industry. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but quiet professionals armed with mathematics, logic, and soldering irons. Their collective labor created what would become the world's first fully integrated air defense network. Yet radar alone was not enough. The echoes detected by chain-home had to be interpreted, filtered, and acted upon in minutes. This challenge fell to Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Dowding was a reserved, methodical man, often misunderstood by his contemporaries. He believed victory would come not from emotion but from system. At his headquarters in Bentley Priory, he and his staff created what was then a revolutionary concept: the Dowding system, an information and control network linking radar stations, observer core posts, and fighter airfields through telephone lines and plotting rooms. At the heart of the system lay the filter room. Here, incoming radar reports were reconciled, verified, and converted into a coherent picture of the air battle. WAAF plotters moved colored markers across large maps, representing raids as they crossed the coast. Each report was passed to group headquarters, then down to sector stations like Biggin Hill, Tangmere, or North Weald, where squadron controllers directed the fighters into position. It was not the hardware of radar that made Britain's defense formidable. It was this organization of knowledge, this orchestration of human and technological precision. By early 1939, the network reached operational readiness. Britain's air defense was no longer a patchwork of guesswork and chance. It was a living organism of data, discipline, and design. Then came war. When Germany invaded Poland on 1 September 1939, Britain declared war 2 days later. The following months, the so-called phony war, were deceptive. There were few attacks, little movement, but beneath the quiet, the system was being refined. The WAAFs trained relentlessly. The engineers hardened their equipment against weather and sabotage. Communications lines were doubled, and new chain-home low stations were added to detect aircraft flying beneath the main system's coverage. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force adapted its tactics. Fighter squadrons practiced vector interceptions guided by ground control, conserving fuel and time. For the first time in military history, command decisions could be based on real-time, instrument-based intelligence. The Luftwaffe, observing from across the Channel, underestimated what it saw. German intelligence dismissed the great masts as early warning beacons or long-range radio transmitters. The true power of radar remained a closely guarded secret. In May 1940, the illusion of calm shattered. The Blitzkrieg struck through the Low Countries and France. Within weeks, the British Expeditionary Force was forced back to the beaches of Dunkirk. As Spitfires and Hurricanes covered the desperate evacuation, the RAF's home defense network was tested for the first time under fire. The lessons were stark. Ground control and early warning gave British fighters an advantage even as France collapsed. Every interception saved lives. Every coordinated sortie proved the system's worth. When France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone. Hitler turned his gaze westward and prepared Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. But to cross the Channel, Germany first needed to destroy the RAF. From July 1940, waves of Luftwaffe bombers and fighters began their assault on the British mainland. The outcome of the Battle of Britain would hinge not on brute strength but on time, minutes between detection and interception. The chain-home towers, silent and watchful, became Britain's early alarm. Each blip of light on a radar screen, each measured echo, offered warning enough to meet the enemy in the air rather than over the cities below. As summer deepened into war, the system's worth would be proven not in laboratories or committees, but in combat, tested every hour by young men who flew and by young women who watched, measured and plotted. It was here, in the coordination between machine and mind, that Britain found her shield. The human face of radar was not the scientist or the engineer, but the quiet young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force who stood for hours at their plotting tables. In the filter room and group operations rooms, they worked in semi-darkness beneath the map lights, the air thick with cigarette smoke and static. Each WAAF plotter held a chinograph pencil and a croupier's stick, pushing small counters marked with bearing height and course. They moved swiftly but without panic, turning scattered radar echoes into meaning. Above them, voices from the radar huts along the coast reported in clipped, precise phrases. To a stranger, it might have sounded chaotic. In truth, it was a kind of music, structured, rhythmic, exact. Each marker on the table represented dozens of lives. A wrong calculation could send a squadron chasing shadows. A correct one could stop a bomber stream before it reached London. They learned to judge the Luftwaffe's habits, the decoys, the feints, the altitude changes. Many were barely 20 years old, yet their poise belied their age. When the war ended, their service was rarely mentioned in dispatches. But in the quiet between raids, when the echoes faded and the phone stilled, they knew what they had done. They had given the RAF the one thing it could not fly without: time. In the summer of 1940, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, faced an unprecedented challenge. The Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF nearly 3-1. To fight battle after battle with limited squadrons required more than courage. It demanded discipline. Dowding's answer was not to chase glory, but to conserve strength. He divided southern England into groups, each under a commander who knew his sector intimately. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, head of No. 11 Group, bore the heaviest burden. From his headquarters at Uxbridge, Park directed the defense of London and the southeast coast, the Luftwaffe's primary target. Every decision depended on timing. Too early, and the fighters would burn precious fuel circling empty skies. Too late, and the bombers would already be over their targets. Radar offered warning, but not certainty. Park learned to trust the rhythm of the reports, the pattern of echoes moving across the plotting tables at Bentley Priory. He directed his squadrons with precision born of instinct and training, sending them aloft in pairs or threes, never wasting energy on scattered chases. Dowding's restraint frustrated some, who longed for large-scale decisive engagements. Yet his caution preserved the RAF's core strength through the hardest weeks. When the Luftwaffe shifted from airfields to cities, the system held firm. The radar towers, the plotting rooms, the controllers, all served a single purpose: to ensure that when Britain fought, she did so only where she must and always with advantage. At first glance, Chainhome looked primitive, a forest of towers and cables, more industrial than futuristic. Yet beneath its simplicity lay a design of remarkable foresight. Each station transmitted bursts of radio energy, invisible waves sweeping across the channel. When those waves struck an aircraft, they bounced back. Receivers on the paired wooden towers caught the faint returning signal, and skilled operators measured its delay and bearing. The mathematics were straightforward. Distance equaled time multiplied by the speed of light, divided by 2. But the challenge lay in scale and sensitivity. Wartime engineers at the Post Office Research Department built transmitters of immense power, running at wavelengths of around 12 meters, capable of detecting aircraft over 100 miles away. The equipment was cumbersome, the displays crude by later standards, a single green line sweeping across a cathode ray tube. Yet those echoes, often faint as whispers, were life-saving intelligence. Each reading was telephoned to fighter command within seconds. To fill the gaps close to the coast, new chain-home low stations were constructed using shorter wavelengths. Better suited for detecting aircraft flying at treetop level, Britain's early warning system became layered and resilient. The Germans had radar too, technically sophisticated, sets aboard ships and aircraft, but they never developed the integrated system that Britain perfected. The true genius of chain-home lay not in its machinery, but in its connection to command. It was the first expression of a modern principle: data fused into action, information turned into survival. The system's human, tactical, and technological strands formed an indivisible whole. Each depended on the other. The scientists who designed the transmitters could not fight the battles. The pilots who fought them could not see the signals. The controllers who coordinated both stood between. As the summer of 1940 wore on, all three strands tightened under pressure. Every raid, every interception, honed the process further. Out of necessity, Britain had built the blueprint for a new kind of war, a war of information. In an age when Britain's defense budget was strained by austerity, radar's very existence depended on a handful of men who understood its promise. Chief among them was Sir Henry Tizard, an Oxford chemist with the mind of an administrator and the courage of a realist. As chairman of the Air Defense Committee, Tizard fought relentlessly to keep science at the heart of national strategy. He saw early that invention without organization would be useless. When skeptical officials questioned the cost of the towers, he answered simply, "The price of ignorance is greater." In the committee rooms of the Air Ministry, Tizard's calm persistence won over doubters. By 1937, radar had become a priority project, even as Treasury clerks frowned at its expense. Tizard insisted the work remain open to civilian experts. He drew in the radio research station, the post office, and industrial firms, Metropolitan Vickers, EMI, and General Electric Company, forging a partnership between government, academia, and private enterprise that defined wartime Britain. When others demanded secrecy above all, Tizard balanced discretion with collaboration. It was his faith in shared knowledge that later led to the Tizard mission, the 1940 scientific delegation to America, carrying Britain's greatest technological secrets, including radar and the newly developed magnetron. It was, in essence, an act of trust between allies. Leadership, in Tizard's view, meant not commanding science but listening to it. His gift was to convince statesmen that the nation's survival rested not on numbers of guns, but on clarity of vision. When the Luftwaffe turned from airfields to cities in the autumn of 1940, radar could no longer prevent destruction, but it could still save lives. Warnings transmitted from the chain-home network reached the air raid precautions offices and local wardens' posts, allowing sirens to sound minutes before bombs fell. Those minutes were often the difference between escape and death. In London, Daventry, Plymouth, and countless smaller towns, civilians learned to live by the rhythm of radar and siren. The system extended its watch beyond military use, becoming the unseen guardian of ordinary people. Children were carried to shelters, factories paused production, hospitals moved patients underground, all in response to signals that began as a flicker on a cathode ray tube far away on the coast. The emotional endurance of the British people during the Blitz is well recorded. Firemen working through the nights, railwaymen keeping lines open amid rubble, wardens guiding the injured through smoke-filled streets. Yet what sustained them beyond courage was confidence, the belief that someone, somewhere, was watching the skies on their behalf. The psychological effect was immense. In the BBC's war reports, civilians often spoke of the girls on the radar as if they were guardian angels. Few understood the details, but all knew that Britain possessed a secret advantage, something unseen, yet profoundly reassuring. It was not simply radar that saved lives, but the moral bond it created between those who watched and those who endured. Radar's greatest strength lay in its secrecy. Throughout 1939 and 1940, the Security Service, MI5, and the Special Branch of the RAF Police worked tirelessly to protect the chain-home sites from espionage. Workers were bound by the Official Secrets Act, and all references to radar were masked under the term RDF. German reconnaissance flights photographed the towers, but Luftwaffe analysts misread them. Believing them to be ordinary radio masts, they saw no reason to attack them systematically. Even when bombers occasionally hit a station, like Ventnor, damaged in August 1940, the network was designed with redundancy. Signals could be rerouted, backup sites activated within hours. Inside Britain, MI5 monitored letters, rumors, and the press. There was strict censorship of all references to radio detection. Even the pilots who benefited from radar guidance often did not know how it worked. When asked, they were told only that ground control had their bearings. The deception extended abroad. The Air Ministry leaked false information suggesting that Britain relied mainly on the Observer Corps, the human watch posts that spotted aircraft visually. This was partly true and partly theater. The real secret was electronic. Not until 1941 did the Germans grasp the full significance of the mass they had ignored. By then it was too late. The window of invasion had closed, and Britain's defense had hardened into legend. The quiet intelligence effort that kept radar hidden was as vital as the engineering that made it possible. In a war defined by machines, secrecy remained the most human weapon of all, built from discipline, silence, and trust. The human, tactical, technological, political, moral, and secret strands of the radar story now converged. Each formed part of an invisible architecture that bound Britain together in its hour of need. The hour, time had come for that system to face its ultimate test in open battle. August 1940. The day began quietly along the English coast. A soft haze hung over the channel. Gulls wheeled above chalk cliffs. To those watching from radar huts and operations rooms, it looked like any other morning. But the screens told a different story. At 05 hours, the first traces appeared, tiny blips far out to sea north of Denmark and west of Brittany. Within minutes, the filter room at Bentley Priory was alive. Lines of colored markers crept steadily across the plotting tables. Controllers spoke in low, measured tones. This was not one raid, but several, converging from 3 directions. The Luftwaffe was launching its most ambitious assault yet. From their bases in Norway, Denmark, and northern France, nearly 1,800 German aircraft were in the air. Their targets were airfields, radar stations, and cities across Britain, from the south coast to Yorkshire. It was an attempt to crush fighter command in a single day. At the chain home station at Poling, WAAF operator Joan Stutchfield noted a dense cluster of returns, faint at first, then unmistakable. She called the report through. At Ventnor, Dunkirk, and Bawdsey, other stations confirmed. Within minutes, the filter room had the full picture. At Bentley Priory, the duty controller traced the markers with a fingertip. Multiple raids. Bearings confirmed. Estimate 300 plus. Dowding stood behind him, silent. His mind was already working through the implications. Woods Group, prepare to scramble. The order traveled through the network like a pulse through nerve tissue. At Uxbridge, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park received it and leaned over his operations map. Tangmere, Biggin Hill, Kenley stand by. Squadrons to readiness. On the grass fields of southern England, the calm broke. Mechanics pulled chocks, engines roared. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft, goggles down, scarves whipping in the wind. Spitfires and Hurricanes clawed into the sky, glinting like blades in the sun. From this point onward, the radar chain became the orchestra conductor of battle. As each new echo appeared, the network adjusted. Controllers guided fighters not in guesswork but in geometry. Vectors calculated from echoes, bearings, and speed. The Luftwaffe, expecting surprise, found waiting formations of British aircraft ready to meet them. By mid-morning, the skies over the channel were a chaos of contrails and smoke. At 11 AV, formations from Denmark struck northern England, expecting unguarded skies. Yet radar at Stakston Wold, the northernmost link in the chain, had seen them coming. Squadrons from Yorkshire and Lincolnshire were already airborne. At 13 Quad, another wave crossed from northern France, heading for Kent and Sussex. The coastal masts at Dover and Foreness lit up with echoes. Within seconds, the warning reached 11 Group. Park's voice was steady. Scramble 54. 610. Intercept at Angels 15, heading 080. In the air, Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere of No. 54 Squadron sighted the enemy. Columns of Heinkels and Dorniers flanked by Messerschmitt 109s. The interception was textbook. The first bombers jettisoned their loads prematurely into the channel. Others turned back before reaching land. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost 75 aircraft, its heaviest single-day loss of the campaign. The RAF lost 34. But the significance lay not in numbers, it was in control. Fighter Command, aided by radar, had met a vast, complex assault and repelled it on every front. The German command, still confident, failed to grasp how Britain managed to concentrate its fighters so efficiently. They assumed the British must possess enormous reserves of aircraft. In truth, the secret was information, the ability to know before the enemy arrived exactly where to strike. In the calm of evening, radar screens along the coast flickered back to emptiness. Operators removed their headsets, rubbed their eyes, and exhaled. Another day survived. Yet there was no celebration, only quiet relief and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same routine, the same strain. At Bentley Priory, Dowding reviewed the reports. The system had held. The masts stood, the lines hummed, the pilots returned. It was not victory. Not yet, but it was proof that science, precision, and human steadiness could turn the tide against overwhelming odds. That night, as fires smoldered across Kentish fields and pilots slept fitfully beside their aircraft, technicians at the coastal stations recalibrated their instruments. The hum of transmitters filled the darkness once more. For the first time in the war, Britain had done more than survive a day of battle. She had mastered its rhythm, but the test was far from over. The sun would rise again on new tactics, new dangers, and a different kind of warfare, the silent threat of the night. The victory of 15th of August 1940 proved that Britain's system could meet daylight attack head-on. Yet the enemy adapted. As losses mounted, the Luftwaffe turned to darkness. By September, the great daytime raids gave way to the Blitz, a sustained campaign of night bombing aimed at breaking British morale. In the hours after dusk, the pulse of radar screens slowed. Chainhome, designed for high-altitude daylight detection, struggled to follow bombers at low levels through the dark. The echoes blurred into the clutter of ground returns. The technology that had saved Britain by day was suddenly half-blind by night. In London, Daventry, and Liverpool, sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire into the blackness, guided more by instinct than by instruments. Spotters strained to see what radar could no longer show. The sky flickered with searchlights, their beams sweeping like restless fingers across the clouds. But British ingenuity did not rest. Even as bombs fell, scientists and engineers were working to close the gap. In laboratories at Bawdsey, Worth-Matravers, and the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, teams raced to develop new systems. Ground-controlled interception, GCI, and airborne interception, AI, radar that could restore sight to the defenders of the night. Among them was a breakthrough from the University of Birmingham, the cavity magnetron. Compact, powerful, and capable of generating centimetric wavelengths, it transformed radar from a crude early warning tool into a precision instrument. Where Chainhome had used long waves and towering masts, centimetric radar could fit inside an aircraft. The fighter itself would become a flying radar station. By late 1940, the first AI-equipped Bristol Beaufighters were flying operational sorties. Guided initially by ground radar, they homed in on enemy bombers using their own onboard sets, watching glowing spots on screens that represented aircraft invisible to the human eye. In the blackness above England, unseen duels unfolded between machines sensing each other's presence by radio waves alone. Meanwhile, on the ground, GCI stations began to emerge. These new installations combined transmitting and receiving aerials on rotating platforms, allowing controllers to track raids directly and vector night fighters with far greater accuracy. What began as a chain of fixed sentinels was evolving into a fluid, responsive web, a true network defense. For the young women at their consoles, the transition from Chainhome to GCI brought new demands. No longer merely reporting contacts, they now directed pilots in real time. Turn starboard 10. Maintain Angels 12. Contact ahead, range 3 miles. Each instruction was a blend of trust, discipline, and calm under strain. Many never saw the aircraft they guided, nor the enemies they helped destroy. The Luftwaffe, still believing that darkness guaranteed safety, met growing resistance. Losses mounted. Confusion spread among bomber crews. What they could not see, they began to fear. The myth of night invincibility began to fade. By the spring of 1941, the technological balance had shifted again. The radar revolution, driven by Watson Watt's first experiment and refined through necessity, had entered a new phase. The defense of Britain was no longer static. It was dynamic, adaptive, and deeply human. In April 1941, a report from the Air Ministry's Directorate of Signals summed up what had been achieved. The system has proven flexible under pressure. Each technical development, however modest, multiplies the effectiveness of our existing defenses. The network now forms an indivisible organism. The word organism was no exaggeration. From radar towers to plotting tables, from scientists to pilots, Britain's defense had become a single living system, capable of perceiving, thinking, and responding. When Churchill addressed the nation that summer, his words carried the calm pride of a people who had endured the storm. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Yet the few were not only the pilots. They were also the watchers, the mathematicians, the signalers, and the engineers who had given those pilots the means to fight and return home alive. By the time the last great night raids of 1941 subsided, radar had become Britain's most decisive weapon, quiet, invisible, and exacting. The once laughable idea of detecting aircraft with radio waves had matured into a system that spanned continents and oceans. In laboratories across Britain, engineers now worked to refine the magnetron and its applications. Its power would soon be shared with the United States through the Tizard mission, fueling Allied advances in radar-guided artillery, naval gunnery, and airborne detection. From the ashes of the Blitz, a new kind of warfare emerged, one based not on brute force but on information. Britain's survival had proven that victory could be achieved not only with courage and numbers, but through foresight, patience, and the disciplined use of science. And yet, behind every technical triumph lay the same quiet truth, that it all began with one man who refused to laugh at the idea of a death ray. From Daventry to Dover, from Bawdsey to Bentley Priory, the echo of his decision still lingered, in the hum of transmitters and the calm voices of controllers watching the night sky. The worst had passed, but the reckoning, the tally of loss, cost, and consequence was still to come. When dawn broke over Britain in the spring of 1941, the nation stood scarred but unbroken. The Blitz had taken over 40,000 civilian lives, destroyed tens of thousands of homes, and reduced city centers to rubble. Yet the country still functioned. Trains ran, post was delivered, factories produced. The Luftwaffe had failed to crush British industry, morale, or command. Behind this endurance lay a web of systems that had matured under fire. The chain home network, damaged repeatedly, had proven remarkably resilient. Every station had been built with redundancy, duplicate transmitters, secondary power supplies, and rapid repair crews. When masts were struck, as at Ventnor in August 1940, mobile units restored coverage within hours. Britain's radar net had absorbed punishment and continued to see. The Air Ministry's post-battle analysis, preserved today in the National Archives at Kew, revealed the stark outcome. From July to October 1940, the RAF had lost 1,023 aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost nearly double. More crucially, Britain retained control of her skies. The radar-directed intercepts had allowed Dowding and Park to deploy fighters efficiently, conserving strength against overwhelming odds. This victory did not rest on individual heroics, though courage was abundant, but on organization. Every interception began as a trace of electrons on a cathode ray tube, passed through the hands of plotters, filtered by analysts, and transformed into a command. The process turned information into action in minutes. In that chain, every link mattered equally: scientist, operator, controller, pilot. By late 1941, the radar shield extended beyond the southern coast. New chain home stations covered Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Low-level and mobile radar filled remaining gaps. The Observer Corps, now the Royal Observer Corps, continued visual coverage inland. Together they formed a layered defense so complete that even surprise attacks became rare. For the first time, Britain had a true integrated air defense system, a concept decades ahead of its time. The human toll was immense, Yet the spirit of collaboration it fostered reshaped British science and military thought. Research establishments, once isolated, learned to cooperate across disciplines and industries. The same engineers who repaired transmitters by day helped develop new circuits by night. From the ashes of urgency grew a culture of innovation that would outlast the war. Fighter command evolved too. In 1941, with improved GCI and AI radar, night fighting became systematic. The Beaufighter squadrons that once groped through darkness now operated with near-surgical precision. Bomber losses mounted, the tide turned. At Bentley Priory, the filter room continued its silent duty, now coordinating raids into occupied Europe. The same plotting tables that had once defended London now guided offensive missions. Britain had moved from reaction to initiative. The political and psychological consequences of radar's success were profound. For the first time since 1939, the British people believed the war could be won. Churchill recognized its symbolic power. In a private memorandum of late 1940, he wrote, "Our new defensive radio location system has proven itself a decisive advantage. The enemy, whose arrogance underestimated our science, has paid dearly." In factories from Coventry to Chelmsford, men and women built radar sets with the same determination as those who assembled aircraft. Each unit bore the quiet pride of something more than machinery. It was part of the nation's endurance. When Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's invasion plan, was indefinitely postponed in October 1940, the official reason given was the weather and the RAF's resistance. But among Germany's officers, another truth circulated privately, that Britain somehow always knew. By the end of 1941, the word radar was still unknown to the public. The technology remained classified, spoken of only as special apparatus. Yet its results were visible everywhere, from the quiet confidence of fighter command to the steady pulse of British resilience. The war was far from over, but the existential threat had passed. Radar had given Britain the precious gift of survival and time to strike back. The next phase would take that gift abroad, across the Atlantic, into the laboratories of America, and ultimately into every field of warfare that followed. When dawn broke over Britain in the spring of 1941, the nation stood scarred but unbroken. The Blitz had taken over 40,000 civilian lives, destroyed tens of thousands of homes, and reduced city centers to rubble. Yet the country still functioned. Trains ran, post was delivered, factories produced. The Luftwaffe had failed to crush British industry, morale, or command. Behind this endurance lay a web of systems that had matured under fire. The chain home network, damaged repeatedly, had proven remarkably resilient. Every station had been built with redundancy, duplicate transmitters, secondary power supplies, and rapid repair crews. When masts were struck, as at Ventnor in August 1940, mobile units restored coverage within hours. Britain's radar net had absorbed punishment and continued to see. The Air Ministry's post-battle analysis, preserved today in the National Archives at Kew, revealed the stark outcome. From July to October 1940, the RAF had lost 1,023 aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost nearly double. More crucially, Britain retained control of her skies. The radar-directed intercepts had allowed Dowding and Park to deploy fighters efficiently, conserving strength against overwhelming odds. This victory did not rest on individual heroics, though courage was abundant, but on organization. Every interception began as a trace of electrons on a cathode ray tube, passed through the hands of plotters, filtered by analysts, and transformed into a command. The process turned information into action in minutes. In that chain, every link mattered equally: scientist, operator, controller, pilot. By late 1941, the radar shield extended beyond the southern coast. New chain home stations covered Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Low-level and mobile radar filled remaining gaps. The Observer Corps, now the Royal Observer Corps, continued visual coverage inland. Together they formed a layered defense so complete that even surprise attacks became rare. For the first time, Britain had a true integrated air defense system, a concept decades ahead of its time. The human toll was immense, Yet the spirit of collaboration it fostered reshaped British science and military thought. Research establishments, once isolated, learned to cooperate across disciplines and industries. The same engineers who repaired transmitters by day helped develop new circuits by night. From the ashes of urgency grew a culture of innovation that would outlast the war. Fighter command evolved too. In 1941, with improved GCI and AI radar, night fighting became systematic. The Beaufighter squadrons that once groped through darkness now operated with near-surgical precision. Bomber losses mounted, the tide turned. At Bentley Priory, the filter room continued its silent duty, now coordinating raids into occupied Europe. The same plotting tables that had once defended London now guided offensive missions. Britain had moved from reaction to initiative. The political and psychological consequences of radar's success were profound. For the first time since 1939, the British people believed the war could be won. Churchill recognized its symbolic power. In a private memorandum of late 1940, he wrote, "Our new defensive radio location system has proven itself a decisive advantage. The enemy, whose arrogance underestimated our science, has paid dearly." In factories from Coventry to Chelmsford, men and women built radar sets with the same determination as those who assembled aircraft. Each unit bore the quiet pride of something more than machinery. It was part of the nation's endurance. When Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's invasion plan, was indefinitely postponed in October 1940, the official reason given was the weather and the RAF's resistance. But among Germany's officers, another truth circulated privately, that Britain somehow always knew. By the end of 1941, the word radar was still unknown to the public. The technology remained classified, spoken of only as special apparatus. Yet its results were visible everywhere, from the quiet confidence of fighter command to the steady pulse of British resilience. The war was far from over, but the existential threat had passed. Radar had given Britain the precious gift of survival and time to strike back. The next phase would take that gift abroad, across the Atlantic, into the laboratories of America, and ultimately into every field of warfare that followed. At dawn, the English coast is quiet again. The sea murmurs softly against shingle and chalk. Gulls trace slow arcs above the remnants of rusted towers,